Caught in the tangled web of murder, 3 people confess the secrets that torture their souls. But in the echoes and shadows of the ancient city of Quebec, Canada, walks a man who knows the whole terrifying truth, but can never tell all the strange things his ears have heard. For he is sworn to silence. Grim silence that points the finger of suspicion at him. Crushing silence that brings him the contempt of the people who loved and respected him. Deadly silence that leads him to the 13 steps of the gallows.
This is Foreign Correspondence, deeper into Hitchcock.
Welcome to the 38th episode of Foreign Correspondence,
Deeper into Hitchcock
podcast. My name is Michał Oleszczyk and I'm joined as always by my co-host
Sebastian Smoliński. Hello.
We are a pair of Polish Eastern European film scholars who proceed and analyze Alfred Hitchcock's filmography in chronological order. Last time we talked about Strangers on a Train, and today we will move forward to Hitchcock's next movie, and this is I Confess from 1953, starring Montgomery Clift, Anne Baxter, and Carl Malden. And Sebastian actually this year visited London for a very special conference on I Confess. I really wished I could have joined him, but it was impossible. As I understand it, you spent 2 days in London at University College London simply discussing I Confess from morning till dusk. Is that correct?
It's totally correct. The interlude was the evening screening after the first day, the film screening at the Real Theatre from 35mm print, very good condition. And yes, 2 days analyzing this film from variety of perspectives. Let us thank the organizers who were wonderful and reached out to us and invited us for the conference. Stefan Daquette, Charles Barr, we're sending warm greetings to Professor Barr, who was our guest previously, and Laura Mulvey was also one of the organizers of the conference. Stefan Daquette took most of the responsibilities and was a wonderful host, and I could meet personally many Hitchcock scholars that we've been reading throughout these years of our both podcast and off-podcast adventure with Hitchcock. So also, I know that you've met Sidney Gottlieb personally in New York. I've met him in London, so the editor-in-chief of Hitchcock Annual. So this circle of Hitchcock friends is getting bigger, and I was super happy to be there and to talk about Hitchcock's reception in Poland. That was precisely the Eastern European input to that conference, and I discovered that I Confess hasn't been released during the communist era, and that generally Polish film critics weren't writing about Hitchcock as a, let's say, Catholic or profound filmmaker. Most of the time they were a bit patronizing towards him. I've read many magazines from the 50s, 60s, 70s, so it was kind of an archival adventure, and there were papers about Robert Berg's Hitchcock cinematographer by Denis Nissim. Mary Pomeranz provided interpretation of Quebecois culture in I Confess, and so on. Many very inspiring presentations which testify to the fact that Hitchcock's movies, of course, still have a large following. New interpretations are emerging. It's pretty amazing how much you can read from a single shot from Hitchcock and from I Confess, a movie which is not universally loved by cinephiles. So yes, that was an amazing adventure at University College London, September 7 and 8. 2023.
Yes, I was sad not to be there, but I was very, very proud to see your social media post about it, because this is really wonderful. It was a wonderful opportunity for you, but also for our podcast. This was almost like an obligation that we were invited to this very prestigious Hitchcock event. I love that the program that you brought with you, the printout, it's a very English conference, because there are very clearly marked tea breaks. 10:30 tea and 3:30 tea.
Yes.
So
No coffee.
no coffee and yes. So I was very very glad and we are about to actually start this episode with a discussion of I Confess with one of the panelists. So before we are joined by him, tell us please who our special guest of this episode is.
I had the pleasure to meet James Bogdanski in London, who, by the way, has some distant Polish roots. I asked him about it. And as you can hear, the ending of the last name, which is similar to mine.
Which makes him even
Yes.
more perfect for our podcast.
Yes, he's the perfect guest. He agreed to join us. He teaches film studies at Long Beach City College and El Camino College in Southern California. And he'll be in Los Angeles when we'll be talking with him. His chapter on queer authorship in the television series Penny Dreadful has just been published in the anthology Penny Dreadful and Adaptation, Reanimating and Transforming the Monster, and also he has a forthcoming essay in a companion to Ingmar Bergman on Cries and Whispers, and he's very much interested in queer theory, Hollywood cinema, gothic horror, and so on. So large range of interests, and I found his presentation really interesting. So I'm very happy that we'll be discussing I Confess with him.
Fantastic. And the second you mentioned the last name Bergman, I just thought to myself, wow, I Confess is probably the closest to a Bergmanian drama that Hitchcock ever got to. I mean, I can imagine a version of this film being made by Bergman, you know, like, well, not a pastor because they don't have confession, but still, you know, this figure of tormented man of the frog, you know, and the woman that's, you know, his former lover, and that's probably the Hitchcockian film.
5-minute monologue of Montgomery Clift.
Yes, straight into the
camera
into
of
the camera.
Nick Fist. Yeah,
to Anne Baxter character, you know, like, you just assume that I don't know who I am, but I don't know exactly who I am. Do you? You know, I look at your hands and they are so dry. You know? That's exactly.
We should ask AI to produce this.
Exactly. Probably AI is listening already, is making this film on the spot. Okay, so fantastic. Before you and I discuss I Confess, let's talk with James Bogdanski, who is about to join our virtual studio.
So James Bogdanski is with us. Hello, James.
Hello, how are you?
We're good. We're good.
Very good, and it's wonderful to have you on our podcast to discuss I Confess, a movie that we just introduced a little bit in our episode, and we are very, very thrilled to have you as the expert in this episode.
How is California today?
California is very sunny and very warm. It meets all of the stereotypes that you would have about it.
That's good. Poland is huge winter we have today.
So we are also meeting the stereotypes.
So thank you for being with us. Maybe let's start with your adventure with Hitchcock in general, right? In your interests, you highlight pre-code Hollywood, feminist and queer theory, gothic horror, the post-human. Where does the Hitchcock fit into that landscape, let's say?
I first delved into Hitchcock in high school. I think the first film I saw of his was Rear Window. And then I took a Hitchcock class in college with David Grevin, he's a pretty prominent Hitchcock scholar. And he has a background in queer and feminist theory. So that was really the approach we took to his films. And ever since then, he's just been a cinematic figure of great interest for me, given the breadth of his career and just the multitude of ways that you can get into his films. Like, there's people like to pigeonhole him in all sorts of ways, but he's much too complex for that. So he's the director that's always fresh, no matter how you want to tackle his films.
When was it that you watched I Confess for the first time, and do you remember your initial impression of it?
Good question. I just rewatched it last night for this podcast. The first time, though, it wasn't in an academic setting. I sought it out, I think because of Montgomery Clift, because I wanted to see his brief but spectacular filmography. So it might have been 6 or 7 years ago. And I was also interested in this idea of the film as being this Canadian film noir of sorts. And initial responses to it, I guess, it does feel to me very, I don't know if uncanny is the right word, but it definitely smacks of the Hitchcock aesthetic. But there's something about it that feels so alien because it is set in Canada, and we're dealing with a priestly figure, and so many of Hitchcock's characters are dealing with repressed sexuality. So that's definitely part and parcel of the Father Logan figure. So I think in that regard, I was trying to figure out how it fits with his other films, because that film and I think the one after is The Wrong Man. Those just feel like a very unique period in his work, coming after what Spellbound and Rope, and then before the color films of the 50s. So to me, it was like, just it struck me as a film that doesn't quite fit with all of the others.
Yeah, and it has a bit of a lower critical standing than some of the other 50s films,
Exactly.
but you find it, I think, given your experience with the film, you find it fascinating in a way, right?
Yes, yes, absolutely. Especially given if you want to look from a star studies perspective at Montgomery Clift, as this somewhat repressed figure of masculinity. It's an interesting combination with Hitchcock. We're seeing how he adapts to the Hitchcock milieu. So that really intrigued me. This figure of a star who's, if you want to call him a queer star, a bisexual star, also exploring this repressed sexuality through the film, I confess. I thought that it's almost the perfect pairing of director and star in that way.
And in Montgomery Clift, there's always, I mean, he's like the epitome of like existential maladjustment. You know, I think that there's always something dislodged, you know, in his face, in his persona, in his presence. And he's also, I would say, a little bit maladjusted in this Hitchcock world, you know, because it's by now it's a world that we know, you know, this, you know, the basically the genre of the Hitchcock thriller is very much established by that point. And suddenly there's this strange creature entering this world, you know, unlike any other actors that played for Hitchcock before, because even the, let's say, queer presences in his films like Robert Walker or Ivor Novello, they were more dandy-like, you know, they had this dandy-like quality. And here there's nothing dandy about Monty, you know, Clift. He's strained, you know, he's very, very uncomfortable all the time, I would say. And that's fascinating.
Yeah, and it's the first method actor, right, that ever appeared in a Hitchcock movie as in a starring role, right? Which of course is also interesting because I think we can feel this tension also between Hitchcock's approach, his approach to stars, as you mentioned, and Montgomery Clift's very different way of working and more troubled, let's say, lifestyle than some of the previous stars like James Stewart, for example.
Right, right. And you're alluding to his method acting background as well, which does not really comport with which Hitchcock's preferred style of positioning his actors in very precise ways within the frame. But to your point about Monty seeming very uncomfortable in his own skin, in rewatching the film last night, the first shot we have of him is in the rectory, I believe, where he's looking out and he sees a figure. He doesn't, I don't think, quite know at that point that it's Otto Keller, but he's maybe on the third floor of this building looking out through a pane of glass, and it's just such a startling image because it seems like he's encased from the outside world, like he's in this hermetically sealed frame within a frame. And it just shows how boxed in his character is, I think, within the film as a whole.
Definitely, and I think you're finding very interesting interpretations for that. You interpret, I confess, in a very interesting way. We've met in London live, which doesn't happen in case of all our guests. Some of them we just know from Zoom, but we've met at the Hitchcock conference that I'll maybe describe a bit later. and you delivered a fantastic paper, Hitchcock and the Holocaust, Sacrificial Bodies in I Confess, and we are very happy to have you here because, as I mentioned, this is a movie which is considered more of a minor Hitchcock in these glory days. People are less passionate about it, but you find an amazing, maybe I shouldn't say maybe not to spoil the fun for our listeners, but very interesting tropes and themes to understand, I confess. And also, given that we're recording in Warsaw, you are in California, in LA, right? LA.
Yes, LA.
So also the fact that Otto Keller, as you mentioned in your paper, was born somewhere next to Poznań, so Posen in German. It gives us this additional context, but generally you look at I Confess as a movie about Holocaust. Could you maybe introduce this idea? I had the pleasure of listening to your presentation, and I hope that our listeners will also look at this movie from a new perspective.
Of course. So in approaching the film on like a surface reading, you might not think that the Holocaust has a presence in the story or for the characters beyond perhaps the tangential biographical elements attached to O.E. Hasse, who plays the Otto Keller character. But what I found intriguing in my research is the lead up to the film, how Hitchcock did have some direct involvement in the post-war excavation of the Holocaust and what actually transpired at the camps. And he was approached by this producer, Sidney Bernstein, who had been a long-time collaborator of his, and he was approached to edit material from some of the concentration camps, the liberation footage that was filmed by the Allied troops. And so he worked on it for a number of weeks and compiled footage that was meant to be displayed to German civilians after the war to show them just the degree of the barbarity that happened in their own backyard, so to speak. And the film was never released. It was shelved, and then it was called Memory of the Camps, and it was finally pieced together in the 80s from the Imperial War College in London and released on different networks. So this was, I think, maybe 5 years before he made I Confess. And so what intrigued me was that in his immediate post-war films, you see him, Hitchcock, working through a lot of these issues related to guilt always, but guilt involving fascism and just the legacy of the Holocaust, especially in the film Rope, with which based on a true murder from the 1920s with Farley Granger and Jimmy Stewart. And they deal with this idea of the Superman, right? The Nietzschean Superman who can choose who lives and who dies. And I see a very clear way of tracing that through I Confess with the Otto Keller character, who's the guilty party. Spoilers for people who haven't seen the film.
No, this is fine. This is fine.
Yeah, so he's the guilty man, but his guilt, of course, is transferred to Father Logan through the confessional. And I thought it was a very intriguing idea to explore that Otto Keller, for all of his sin as the murderer, he's a very ambiguous figure in the film. And of course, as your viewers probably are aware, Hitchcock apprenticed in Germany for a time in the 20s, worked on 2 films there. So he is very familiar with German culture, the German film industry, and O.E. Hasse, who did serve in the German armed forces during the war. So clearly selecting a man who is from Germany to play a German. But I found it very, very intriguing that you could read the Keller character as perhaps either an ex-Nazi who has fled to Canada, or we could read him as a Jewish person who has perhaps converted to Catholicism or is living under an assumed identity. And so I think that ambiguity is a way for Hitchcock to explore the ways the Holocaust has really damaged these individuals, including Father Logan, who serves voluntarily in the war. He enlists, and that's what creates the divide between him and Ruth, the Anne Baxter character. So all of these different parts seem to be tracing back to this past, right? Dealing with the unresolved trauma of the past.
Can I provide a quote from your paper, which I
Please do.
Yeah, so speaking about this ambiguity surrounding Otto Keller character, you wrote, the monstrous doubling renders Keller a multivalent figure, Janus-faced, both Nazi and Jew, and yet neither, rendered opaque by the noirish ambiguities in which the film cloaks him. In this way, he recalls the pharmakon, which Plato used to mean both poison and remedy. So this is really kind of explosive stuff when you think about I Confess, right? And I also liked the way in which you analyzed several pieces of dialogue, for example, the one referring to several million people, right? I think it's something Ann Baxter says, right?
Yes.
So these questions also, you could say, of universal guilt, right? This is something that Karl Jaspers was writing about after the war, the problem of this, the guilt of humanity faced with this unthinkable genocide. And yet, when I think you read Otto Keller this way, as this Janus-faced, he starts to be a really interesting figure in this film. So I think I also like the way that we can shift the emphasis from Father Logan to Otto Keller as this more interesting character, right? So maybe once again in Hitchcock's films, the villains are more fascinating than the good guys, I would say.
Yes, I wholeheartedly agree, and I think that's part of my project is rescuing Otto Keller from being an obscure Hitchcock villain, because I was just rereading Robin Wood's book, or his chapter on I Confess, and he really throws the Otto Keller character under the bus, and he says the only interesting thing about the movie is the Ann Baxter subplot. And I think it's quite fascinating, but it's clearly not the only element worthy of our analysis. And like you were saying with Otto Keller, one thing that really stood out to me in rewatching the film last night is the climactic scene outside of the courtyard when he tries to prevent his wife Alma from reaching Father Logan and confessing her husband's crime. And that's the only point in the film where either actor speaks German, where Otto commands her to stop, to come back to him in German. And then when she's dying, I could never make out what she's saying, because I think LaRue doesn't understand her, and it's actually Logan who understands the German. And I actually looked this up and translated it online, but she says, as he translates, "Forgive me," and she's saying that in German. So I think it's very intriguing how in this moment of revelation, right, that's where their mother tongue emerges. So this idea that they're playing with different identities throughout the film, right? He's the obedient painter. The other priests say, "Oh, there's so much we can learn from him. He's so inventive and so reliable." But there's really not much we know about his past, and that's what makes him intriguing. Just like Father Logan, right? There's so much unspoken about who they are and what they did during the war.
And if we remember the German character from Lifeboat, who was also the one that we could learn so much from, right? I find it really, really interesting. Also, the figure of the German in Hitchcock's post-war movies or wartime movies.
Yeah, and now that I listen to you both, I think that, usually we point to those later Hitchcock thrillers from the 60s, like Torn Curtain or Topaz, as films in which Hitchcock revealed his interest in, let's say, geopolitics of the moment, right? But actually, when I listen to both of you, I think that those films like I Confess and Lifeboat are just as, let's say, engaged in the politics of the day. I mean, even by depicting German characters, right? I mean, this is way before, let's say, the good German character that Marlon Brando will play in Young Lions, for example, right? Or even, I don't know, Douglas Sirk, Time to Live and Time to Die. So here is this ambiguous German figure, right, in this movie. But what I rewatched the film yesterday after many years not seeing it. I actually saw it years ago. And this was my second screening after, I think, 20 years. And I was struck by the cleverness of the premise, of course, because here, let's say the sacrament is the MacGuffin, right? because the fact that the priest cannot reveal the secret is really what the entire plot hinges upon. That's the entire point. But what struck me when I watched it again is that actually this is a movie not about one vow of silence, but about two vows of silence, because there is the vow of silence implicit in marriage. Because what we see at the beginning are two confessions, right? Keller confesses to the priest, but then he immediately confesses to his wife. And the wife remains faithful to the husband by not revealing his secret throughout the movie until the very, very last moment. But when I was watching it again, I really focused on her plight even more than on the plight of the priest, because I would say that the actress, the German actress, Dolly Haas, she communicates this guilt and this tremendous weight of the secret very brilliantly, very, very movingly. And the kicker is that she's also blaming herself for what her husband done, because apparently he did it for her, right?
Right.
He says that she wanted a better living. So maybe in her mind, she's blaming herself, maybe I really literally, made this happen. So I thought that probably, this character of the wife is the true, let's say, partner or the true counterpart to Montgomery Clift's priest. And I found her the most moving character in the film, really.
I can see that, and you've got the gears turning in my head that of course there's the mirror imagery, the doubling of Logan and Otto, but now we have Alma and Ruth completing that, and I'm so glad you mentioned her as this second confession, because that stood out to me when I rewatched it last night, that Hitchcock uses a dissolve, I believe, from the confession with Logan to the confession to the wife. So it's quite seamless. Like, we're meant to make that transition. And also the scene where she's serving all the priests in their living quarters, and Hitchcock uses this very strange shot where it's the back of Montgomery Clift's neck, like the nape of his neck, where she's waiting to see if he looks at her strangely because he knows that her husband's killed.
And I would say this is a question to both of you, actually. I don't have the answer. Is that this very scene can make us question who is the main character of the film, because whose perspective are we supposed to share in this scene? I would say that it's her perspective that we are supposed to share. She is the one, actually, the point of view shots.
The suspense is built around her. Right?
Her, and it's just like the scene in Blackmail. This famous sound scene in Blackmail. The knife. They are talking about some trivial stuff, but the woman knows that something really horrible happened. So maybe it's one of those examples in which Hitchcock, even maybe in spite of himself, but he moves the center of identification towards the female character more than to Montgomery Clift. Although I would also argue, if Clift, he's not like a stereotypical male presence in the film. Although maybe in some shots he is, but he's the frock makes him ambiguous in many ways.
The figure of the priest itself makes him like this. Transitional, kind of a drag figure, right? And kind of dressing up is the premise of the plot. So, but only to continue what James said about, there's this first scene of confession when we have this cut between Father Logan and the wife, and there's the suggestion that Otto Keller is actually saying the same thing to both of them. It's like the continuation of that conversation, but we can assume that he's saying something similar. And also, it made me think, at the conference, we were kind of having fun with pointing to these homosexual subtexts, beginning with the flat tire in a bike and so on, but also the scene when they are painting and Otto Keller is like coming to Montgomery Clift character, and he's below the ladder and he's like asking him, they're almost touching, and then the wife comes and we have this shot very neatly mapping three characters, and the wife looks strangely. Is it a look of jealousy or a look of fear? So that's a way of mapping your German, let's say, interpretation onto the sexual one that David Griven, for example, proposed at the conference.
Yes, and I love his term for Montgomery Clift and the type of male figure he groups him with within Hitchcock's oeuvre. I think he called it the tremulous brunette, right, where as opposed to the icy blonde. But yes, I definitely think that's such a valid reading of the Logan character, right? The homoeroticism between him and Otto, that they both have this secret that they're bound up with, and they have to keep it a secret from those around them. And even I think it's perhaps David mentioned this in his paper that Ruth was so heartbroken because Logan volunteers to go to fight, right? It's not like he was conscripted, he enlists voluntarily. So there's this, it's almost the sense that he wanted out of their relationship in some sense, that he was not, the heteronormative lifestyle was not for him. But as you were mentioning with step back a moment to the Alma character, that confessional scene, I think further humanizes Otto in a sense that we realize along with him that Logan cannot betray his secret because of the requirements of the confessional. And to me, that also makes it plausible that Otto may be read as a Jewish character who is masquerading as a Catholic, because he didn't go into the confessional with any ill intent, like I can tell him because he now can't tell anyone else, but he realizes it after the fact that he's protected because of Logan's obligation as a priest. So it's almost like he's piecing it together in a very ramshackle way, that he's not this fully malevolent figure who has this all planned out. That it's really, we see the stages of paranoia as he progresses in the film.
And you also mentioned in your article that when he's asked, when he was confessing the last time, he doesn't remember, he doesn't know, which also is maybe the suggestion, as you interpreted, that it's his first ever confession, right? So
yes.
That's pretty interesting.
That's fascinating, and it's a very subversive reading, to position or to try to position a character as sort of both, or simultaneously, like a possible Nazi or a possible victim of Nazism, But I think it also, your reading reflects this heavy confusion that was in the minds of people in the immediate post-war years, where still the knowledge of what happened wasn't entirely complete. It was still being sort of pieced together, new facts were being discovered all the time, and the world was emerging from a state of chaos. And in this reading, Otto is, like you said, he has those two faces, like the Janus face, and he even has this palindromic name, like you can read this name from either side. But I would say that absolutely what struck me at this second viewing really was the conversation that Otto has with the priest at the very end, right before he is killed. Because when he says to the priest, "You are lonely, you are really alone," and he says, "Oh, I'm not alone," and he says, "Yes, you are," I think he strikes both at the problem of the main character, but also at the problem of the actor, because as we know, Montgomery Clift was a profoundly, sadly lonely person. And here, it's one of those moments where the border is blurred between the character and the actor, because when I see this scene, I cannot help but cry for Montgomery Clift, who's listening to those words, and I think him as a method actor, he probably, listened to them on a very personal level. I don't know if that's reading it too much into it.
Oh, I don't think so, and just let us say what a period for him that was, right?
Yes.
He started making movies just 5 years earlier. The Search, The Heiress, Place in the Sun, next, From Here to Eternity. I mean, these are all Red River, so brilliant performances that didn't age, actually, right? And I think this is fascinating what you said. I also have this feeling that this character may be a problem for Hitchcock as a director of drama because precisely of this detachment. Maybe that's why he was looking for other points of view. And there are many points of view, different points of view in this film. LaRousse, played by Karl Malden, who, by the way, will be father next year in On the Waterfront, which is, well,
that's right.
It's very funny when I couldn't stop thinking about it, But he also has many POVs, including the crucial one when he establishes the link between Anne Baxter and Montgomery Clift when they are outside the window.
I have a question to you. How do you read the Anne Baxter character and the casting of Anne Baxter? Are we supposed to be suspicious of her story just because she's Eve?
Right, all about Eve.
Or like, what's your take on this character and the performance, of course?
I was thinking about that upon my rewatch last night, that she's somewhat atypical for a Hitchcock female lead. Even looking back at his films from the 30s, I was thinking of like Sylvia Sidney in Saboteur. So yeah, there's something about her character that is a little Eve like, especially the flashback, because as I've read in lots of different scholarly accounts, there's something so embellished or fabricated or fantasy like about her flashback, and it reminds me of that shot in All About Eve where she's standing in front of the mirror because everything just seems to have an extra shine to it, and all of her words are very flowery and romantic, which is not to discount her version of events, but there does seem to be this quality of that she's a daydreamer of sorts in the film. And even I feel bad for her poor husband, because he says in one scene in their bedroom, "Do you still love him?" And her response is something like, "I've always loved him, even the day we were married," or something like that. So it cuts very deep. So there's this sense that she just can't move beyond the romance she had with Logan. And so I think that's perhaps one of the reasons Hitchcock cast Anne Baxter, is that her character is so fixated on what they had in the past that she can't live a full life. Like she can't let it go, except at the very end. And I think this Robin Wood mentions this in his book, that what seems so odd dramatically is that when Logan is trying to talk Keller down from shooting the police, Ruth just leaves the scene. She tells her husband, "Take me home." Like, she doesn't even care what happens to Logan at that point. So there's something very unusual about her character, that there's this passion that she can't move beyond, but then at the very end there's like this fickle quality. Suddenly she's done with Logan.
So imagine Anne Baxter having a child with Montgomery Clift, as was the first version of the script. Montgomery Clift wanted to do that, right? McGilligan writes that Montgomery Clift was happy with this project because there was this illegitimate child in the script. So I find it also, I must tell you that I had a crush on Anne Baxter because of All About Eve. For me, she's very sexy in that All About Eve role and so on. So I was really surprised, and kind of like, I felt angry at Hitchcock when he said that he wasn't, he wanted somebody else, a more beautiful actress, that Anne Baxter wasn't enough for her. I think she totally works here, precisely with this All About Eve connection, and this kind of she's a bit unreliable. And you mentioned the husband thing, and of course the husband is first seen when he's advocating for women's rights, which of course makes him kind of a duped figure in a way by her cunning and her colorful past as a character.
And it sets him as a contrast to Logan, like the priesthood. You can't get more traditional and conservative than that. And then here's her progressive husband.
Yeah, but honestly, I haven't studied representation of priests in Hollywood. But of course, when I was rewatching I Confess, I thought immediately about First Reformed and Ethan Hawke. Right, so this, of course, the trope of sexy priest is not new, but
the hot priest, right?
The hot priest, right?
Andrew Scott.
Andrews, yes. So Fleabag and so on. But here, these movies are so much about guilt, and the First Reformed is also about this wider guilt or responsibility, right? It's at a certain moment, it's about the fate of the world, right? As Paul Schrader sees that with. The ecological disaster on the horizon and crisis of faith, and maybe it's not unlike the post-World War II ethical crisis after Holocaust, right? So yeah, the trope of the sexy priest, and I think the Montgomery Clift is super sexy, of course. I mean, probably we didn't have to probably mention that in this conversation, but James, have you been to the screening of I Confess in London from 35mm? during the
Yes,
conference.
yes.
Yeah, so I especially could appreciate his movements and silhouette on a big screen projected on
And
film.
even his hair looks great in the film. You know? I mean, he's probably the first hot priest in the history
Yeah,
of cinema, because
I think so.
before him it's like Bing Crosby, you know, but he's like more affable. But this guy, I mean, it's very striking that this is probably the first like really attractive actor playing a priest in this way. You know, that's also
Yes.
quite physical, and that's interesting. I don't know what are your thoughts on this.
I support that reading, that not only is he so physically striking, but he has this conflicted inner turmoil, whereas the Bing Crosby figure doesn't really, right? His interior life is pretty placid. But I remember when Fleabag came out, I mentioned that to David Greffen jokingly as an aside, that here's Monty, the original hot priest.
Oh yeah,
There you go.
Our minds think alike.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's just funny that there's this strange duality, you know, to the scenes in which he is in wearing his frock, you know, and in which he is like dressed as a civilian, mostly in the flashback sequence, because I have sort of trouble connecting those two images. You know, they look so differently, even when he's painting. You know, like and he's like in a shirt, you know, with his arm sleeves up. I mean, there's this duality. I don't know. He's very, very enigmatic in this role, I would say. I don't know how to see it.
I also think method actors are so associated with their off-screen style, right? Like James Dean, Marlon Brando, you know. So the not only, but even when they are, some of them, at least the 1950s ones, even when they are in the movie, they are still, you know, these larger than life tormented personalities like James Dean, right? We associate him with these three roles he played, but still he's James Dean. And I think there's something not maybe equally as with James Dean, but there's something like that going on with Montgomery Clift, that we so much associate him with, you know, the subversive element of the 50s, that it's difficult for us to believe in him as a priest, right? So I think it's much easier to you know, to accept Carl Malden on the waterfront.
Yeah, and we never see him perform mass or anything, right? He's just walking around in this frock.
Yeah, it's always in the after hours capacity. We never see him in the job.
I wanted to ask both of you about Carl Malden's role, because every time I read something about this film, everybody is saying, oh yes, this is the first time that Hitchcock is working with a method actor, Montgomery Clift. But nobody mentions that there are two method actors here, because Carl Malden is a method actor. He worked with Elia Kazan famously, and to Oscar-winning results in Streetcar Named Desire before this, and after this in On the Waterfront, as you mentioned. But yet we don't think necessarily of Malden as a method actor, because he's sort of avuncular. But what is your reading of this character? Like, what's because he's probably like the main antagonist of the main character. Really, he's trying to get him behind bars.
Right. He's an equally complex figure, as a number of papers at the London conference attested to, and it's Carl Malden, so you can't quite hate him, right, as other Hitchcock antagonists. And he has the choir boy background, so he's clearly somewhat sympathetic, right? He thinks if a priest is truly to blame for this murder, it's also an attack on his own faith. But he's just so dogged, right, in that conversation he has with Logan about too much mystification, right? You see him already forming his theory of the case, like what actually happened, and the way he misleads Ruth into confessing to the affair, even though he didn't need that information, right? He knew that the time that Logan was with her was not the exact time of the murder, and so there are all these ways that he's painted as a very underhanded figure, and just wants to get his man, right? There's something about him that rubs one the wrong way, I guess. But I'm thinking of the first moment we meet the Crown prosecutor at, I think it's at a party, right, at the Ruth and her husband's house, and I guess what Hitchcock does is he shows him with all these different party tricks at certain points, where he's balancing a glass on his head. But there's one scene, I think, where he's talking with LaRue in his office, and he has a coin that's
Oh, yeah.
wedged between two
Yeah.
forks above a glass of red wine. It's just the most bizarre image. And I don't want to read too much into it, but I love how it is this sense that like there are these institutional forces coming to bear right on both sides, whether it's the church or the parliament and the police force, and being suspended right above a bloody abyss. So that's how I see LaRue, right? He's just closing in on Logan more and more in his personal life, but also in terms of the murder case. So there's this sense that he's the antagonist, as you both put it, but he's also the one who's trying to rupture the secrets that everybody has, right? He's as any good detective does. So there's the sense that the narrative requires him to constantly build towards the revelations that come out.
And I also think he's, from our perspective, a pretty modern figure, meaning that he doesn't privilege the Father Logan, right? He doesn't say, oh, he's a priest, so, maybe we should kind of go around him, maybe ask him in a delicate way. No, he has this modern perspective that you're a priest or you're not, it doesn't matter, you can be a killer, right? I think this is something. And I remember that Mary Pomeranz delivered a very sophisticated paper on Quebecois culture and LaRue's as this kind of anti-church authority figure, and the one also who wants to climb up the ladder thanks to this case. I mean, I cannot even reconstruct it because it was so detailed and kind of reading a lot into the movie, but this LaRue's as a figure who wants to kind of be one of the members of the party thanks to this case and so on. It's also interesting trope that I wanted to mention.
Well, this has been fascinating, and we really appreciate you finding the time. I just personally wanted to ask, I'm just curious because I Confess is not the obvious film to revisit. It's not one of those golden classics of Hitchcock in the 50s. Is there any other quote unquote minor Hitchcock that you think is ripe for rediscovery, or maybe as subversive or interesting from his whole filmography?
That's a great question. I know the conference we attended already did Under Capricorn. That would have been another one. I know it's not regarded as amongst his best, so I don't know if it's a neglected film, but I've always been struck by Frenzy as this sort of last gasp of Hitchcock greatness. And I know a lot of people are turned off by it in terms of the graphic nature of it. It's a little almost beyond the pale for what Hitchcock normally shows in terms of murders. But I just think there's something about it where it's I mean, Hitchcock's always on the cusp of modernity, right? He's never an antiquated director, but that film just feels like he's trying to tackle this new societal shift that's underway in London and England, in terms of a franker attitude towards sex and promiscuity. So I think it's this film that should be perhaps reconsidered as more in keeping with Hitchcock's general fascinations as a director. It's not some strange outlier where he's just trying to stay current and stay relevant.
That's a great idea for the future of our podcast, because eventually we'll get there, and who knows, maybe we're a bit
split, right?
Yes, but I also I dislike the film, or I would say I dislike the memory of the film, because I saw it around 15 years ago last time, and I remember this shudder of horror because it was simply so vile in a way. But I'm always curious with Hitchcock, because you never know. And you mentioned this modernity, this flirtation with modernity. It's also there in I Confess. This opening with those arrows, saying direction, or direction. I mean, it's almost like Godard, like those
World of Science.
In Vivre sa vie, or using those signs and letters interrupting the action. I mean, this is basically the director saying, this story is starting. Look here, I will draw an arrow for you. It's very, very modern, I would say.
Yeah.
I agree. The flourish of the avant-garde in the opening.
Absolutely.
James, so one last question. Do you have publishing plans for the essay so far? Are you planning to let's say, make it public, your paper on I Confess?
Yes, I'm trying to decide what the best venue would be. Perhaps the Hitchcock Annual Journal, or the journal for SCMS, the Society for Cinema and Media Studies, which has an online publication, but they also have the physical journal as well. So I don't know if I should just submit to both and see what comes of it, but I definitely want to publish it in some form. There's more research to be done to expand it and look into areas that might benefit from a little more critical attention.
Sounds good, and fingers crossed.
Fantastic. And when I look at your apartment behind you, I very comforted because it seems that every film buff's apartment looks the same. Like my apartment is exactly the same, like stacks and stacks of books
that's true.
And
That's
DVDs and stuff. So it's always too little space and too many DVDs. And
You still have place for your own bed. So
Yes.
as long as you have a place to sleep, that's right.
I'm thankful to hear you say that. I have suspended shelves above us that you can't see out of frame that line the walls. So yeah, it's a lifelong love affair with books and movies.
Thank you so much, James. It was an absolute pleasure and an honor. So hopefully stay in touch, and thank you so much for discussing I Confess with us.
I'm so grateful. Thank you.
Thank you.
So that was James Bogdanski, and I'm very, very happy about this conversation. Lots of great tropes. Is there anything else that we could discuss about the film? Are there any things that you found striking?
One question to you, because this movie is usually, interpreted as a Catholic film, as the most explicitly Catholic film that Hitchcock made, along with The Wrong Man. After rewatching this movie yesterday, do you agree with that? Do you think this theme of religion is really treated, in depth, or it's just another curtain?
No, I don't agree with this. And I think that anyone who says that this is the most Catholic film that Hitchcock made never saw Psycho, because I think Psycho is the most Catholic, actually. But just because, well, we'll get to that. But I actually would say, and, we didn't have a chance yet, but my big question mark connected to this film is that I don't feel that Hitchcock is really invested in this sort of Catholic theme of this story. I think he's very invested in the melodrama because it's actually very melodramatic, and I think, as I said before, that he is very sympathetic towards the character of Alma as this woman who is carrying the guilt of some other person, of her husband. But really, I don't think that, Catholicism here provides a very, very useful gimmick because, this idea that, the secrecy of confession cannot be violated, it's a great construction. It's a logical construction. And I also would say it's a nice provocation towards, let's say, the Protestant majority in the States, because we even find in the reviews of the film that, many waspy critics found this implausible, that, this cannot be like this, this. And Hitchcock, as a Catholic, he knew very well that it's treated very, very seriously, right? By the Catholic Church, but also by the faithful. And in the making of video of this film, one of Hitchcock's biographers says that there's this huge correspondence between Hitchcock and Joseph Breen, who was the head of the production code office and, the head censor, basically, of Hollywood, who also was educated in Jesuit school. And he says that this whole correspondence between them resembles one of those long discussions that two Jesuit schoolboys can have about the niceties and details of Catholic doctrine. Does Montgomery Clift looking at Otto Keller in the courtroom already constitute the breach of the confession or not, etc. So I just want to say this. I think that Catholic doctrine provides a very nice plot idea here, but I don't think that this is a film that really deals with guilt and with those primary emotions that Hitchcock had about some Catholic ideas like grace, like forgiveness. I think this is pretty superficial on this. Yeah. And if you want to feel like deep pang of Catholic feeling in Hitchcock, I would point to The Wrong Man, which is much deeper and much more felt. I mean, not just on this level. And I would say Psycho, because I think Psycho does this horrible trick of killing off Marion, and of course in the middle of the movie, right after she actually quote unquote converted, because she's a sinner, she's an adulteress, and she's a thief, and she meets Norman. She has this long conversation, and she decides to change her life. She decides, to return the money and go back, and she's killed at this very moment. And I think it's a very, very bleak joke on behalf of the doctrine, but also she dies in a state that the Catholic doctrine would describe as grace, because she actually repented for her sins. But we'll talk about it a different time.
Yes,
I confess, I think Catholicism is simply a plot device in this film more than anything else.
Yes, and also I'm thinking about the fact that 1950s were at least there were several directors who really excelled in transcendental cinema, right, as Paul Schrader called it. I'm thinking that before I Confess we had Diary of a Country Priest, and after I Confess we had Ordet by Dreyer. So like two masterpieces of, not Catholic, one is Catholic, the other is not, of course, it's Protestant, but two masterpieces of the spiritual cinema.
And this is based on a French play, right? Another.
Yeah, so I'm thinking, I would agree with you that it's kind of a gimmick, and maybe we're expecting too much. I mean, or the French were expecting too much, because this was also one of the favorite Hitchcock movies for the Cahiers du Cinéma crowd. Romer and Chabrol, and I think even Truffaut a bit, they really considered it like a major Hitchcock because precisely of these themes, that the auteur finally focuses on these themes. But also I'm thinking about a very obscure movie. Maybe our listeners want to have a kind of recommendation of a Polish film that you can actually find somewhere online for free with English subtitles on the Polish platform 35mm. Lynx Ryś is the Polish title. It's set during World War II, and one of Poland's best actors, Jerzy Radziwiłowicz, plays the priest. The home army dissident soldier confesses to him that he needs to shoot someone. It's the home army, so the underground movement at the time. It's their decision, and he's carrying this guilt. And I must say, this obscure Polish film by the great director that probably nobody have heard.
Stanisław Różewicz.
Yes, outside Poland, or certainly most of our English language listeners don't know him. Jerzy Radziwiłowicz is also a very handsome actor. Kind of, maybe a bit Cliftian, but just a bit. So, there is this trope of not only of a hot priest, but also the priest as the one who's carrying, maybe too much knowledge. And I'm thinking that maybe in 21st century, as the progression from religion to psychoanalysis shows us, therapists are in modern TV shows, modern movies, maybe the ones who will have too much knowledge. And I'm just thinking that so many dramas, including You Hurt My Feelings, are focused around, the figure of a therapist as the one who has more access, carries more knowledge, but is still human in a way.
Okay, right. And it's also bound by secrecy, right?
Exactly.
So not sacramental, but professional. I love this link, and the link to Lynx. This is the film, Lynx, just like the animal. Ryś is a very good Polish film, and I never made this connection, but it's wonderful. Yeah, I would just say that I think it's a very interesting film. I don't laugh, I confess. I think it's full of contradictions, and many of them cannot be even explored by the film, like, the sexuality of the main actor and stuff. But it's interesting, but Hitchcock is on the cusp of making some real masterpieces in this decade. So this, I would say, feels a bit antiquated, just like Cobblestone Street in Quebec, does. But
that was poetic.
The title, I confess, also would suggest something very personal. But I think that we are about to discuss some films that simply will take us into another level in terms of image, sound, style, and themes as well. So this feels more like a throwback to the older Hitchcock, to the slightly melodramatic Hitchcock. And also, as James brilliantly pointed out, this is a film haunted by German cinema. Not only by German actors like O.E. Hasse and Dolly Haas, but by German cinema as such. I mean, can't you just imagine the story? I can perfectly imagine it as like a Kammerspiel film in the 20s. You know, there's the priest, there's the lover, there's the guild. This could be a story by, you know, Fritz Lang or Pabst or somebody else. Also with this silent interlude, you know, this flashback sequence which feels like a bad German movie from the 20s. So yeah, I was happy to revisit it, but I will also be happy to move on because we have some wonderful films in store.
So next episode, Dial M for Murder.
Yes, and I wish I could watch it in 3D. Did you ever see it in 3D?
No, but my mother has a 3D TV. So maybe you can arrange a home screening.
Who knows? Maybe we'll see it that way. So this was P for Priest, and M for Murder will be next. If you like this episode, please rate us on iTunes, share the link to our podcast, and we are looking forward to the next episode of Foreign Correspondence.
Deeper into Hitchcock.